The baby shower was supposed to be a celebration of new life, but it became the day I finally showed my son-in-law exactly what kind of woman he'd been underestimating for the past 3 years. When Marcus opened that envelope with trembling hands, his face went white as he read the first line of documents that would change everything he thought he knew about his wife's mother. The room fell silent as the truth about my $50 million trust fund spilled out like a secret that had been waiting decades to surface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that watching my daughter open presents at her baby shower would be the moment I'd finally understand the true nature of the man she'd married. After raising Elena as a single mother for 26 years, working double shifts at the textile factory and saving every penny I could, I thought I'd earned the right to enjoy this milestone without judgment. Instead, I got a masterclass in humiliation served up with pink and blue decorations. The community center on Maple Street was transformed with soft pastels and twinkling lights, exactly the way Elena had dreamed. My daughter's radiant smile made every sacrifice I'd made worth it as she sat surrounded by friends and family, her hands resting protectively over her 7-month bump. At 62, I was finally going to be a grandmother, and the joy of that reality had sustained me through months of planning and preparation. That's when I noticed Marcus whispering to his college buddies near the gift table, his voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments of his commentary. The man my daughter had fallen in love with, the insurance adjuster who'd swept her off her feet with his charm and ambitious talk, was holding up my carefully wrapped present like it was evidence in a court case. $25 at Target, he said with a snort that made my chest tighten. Elena's mom really went all out this time, same woman who gave us a toaster from the thrift store for our wedding. His friends chuckled, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I pretended to arrange the punch bowl while listening to him dissect my gift-giving history. Marcus had always been particular about appearances, about brand names and price tags, but I'd attributed it to youth and inexperience. Elena had met him during her final year at the community college where she'd worked so hard to earn her nursing degree while I covered her tuition and expenses. He'd been everything I wasn't: polished, well-spoken, from a family that took vacations and drove new cars. I mean, I get it, Marcus continued, apparently emboldened by his audience. She's just a factory worker, probably doesn't understand what quality actually costs. But for her only grandchild, you'd think she'd at least try to step up. The words hit me like a physical blow, factory worker. As if those words diminished everything I'd accomplished, everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed to give Elena opportunities I'd never had. As if the woman who'd worked 16-hour days to pay for her daughter's education, who'd never missed a school play or parent conference despite exhaustion, who'd turned down every man who'd shown interest because Elena came first, was somehow less worthy of respect because of how I earned my living. I glanced around the room, hoping no one else had heard his casual cruelty, but I caught my sister Patricia's eye from across the room. Her expression told me she'd witnessed the entire exchange, and the mixture of anger and sympathy on her face made my humiliation complete. Patricia knew better than anyone what those years had cost me, how many dreams I'd deferred, how many nights I'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table with bills spread around me like puzzle pieces I couldn't quite fit together. Elena was laughing with her coworkers from the hospital, completely oblivious to her husband's commentary about her mother's inadequacies. She looked so happy, so content in her bubble of anticipation about the baby that was coming in just 2 months. The last thing I wanted was to shatter that happiness with the knowledge that the man she'd married saw her family as beneath him. But as I watched Marcus continue his performance for his friends, making jokes about bargain basement gifts and knowing your audience, something inside me shifted. This wasn't about a $25 baby blanket or a second-hand toaster. This was about a man who'd convinced my daughter to marry him while secretly despising the woman who'd raised her, the sacrifices that had made Elena's success possible, the family history that had shaped who she'd become. Marcus had no idea that the woman he was mocking had been making decisions about his future for months, had been watching, listening, evaluating whether he was worthy of the daughter I'd poured my entire life into raising. Had been testing his character in ways he'd never suspected, waiting to see if the man Elena loved was someone I could trust with her happiness. The gift table groaned under the weight of presents from Elena's friends and colleagues, expensive strollers and designer baby clothes and high-tech monitors that cost more than I made in a month. My simple offering, a hand-knitted blanket and matching booties in soft yellow wool, looked modest beside the elaborate displays of affluence surrounding it. I'd spent weeks working on that blanket during my lunch breaks, choosing yarn the color of sunshine because we didn't know if the baby would be a boy or girl. Time for presents, Elena's best friend Chloe announced, and the room reorganized itself into a circle around my daughter's chair. I found myself sitting directly across from Marcus, who was still smirking about something one of his friends had whispered in his ear. The anticipation in the room was infectious as Elena began unwrapping gifts, each reveal accompanied by squeals of delight and appreciative comments about thoughtfulness and generosity. The expensive gifts came first, each one more elaborate than the last. A $1,000 stroller system from Elena's sorority sisters. A complete nursery set from Marcus's parents, who'd driven up from their gated community in Scottsdale specifically for this event. Professional photography packages and designer diaper bags and enough baby clothes to outfit triplets. Elena's joy was genuine as she thanked each giver, but I noticed how Marcus positioned himself beside each expensive gift, basking in the reflected glow of generosity he'd had no part in providing. His parents had money, old money from real estate investments and family businesses, and Marcus had grown up assuming that wealth was the natural order of things, that people like me were simply background characters in the story of his success. My gift was near the bottom of the pile, wrapped in simple brown paper with a hand-drawn bow, because I'd never been good at fancy decorating. When Elena picked it up, I saw Marcus lean forward slightly, probably preparing another witty observation about his mother-in-law's thriftiness. But as Elena unwrapped the blanket and held it up to the light, her face transformed with something I hadn't expected to see. "Oh, Mom," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate pattern I'd worked into the yarn. "This is beautiful. Look at this detail, Marcus. Look how tiny these stitches are. She must have spent months on this." For a moment Marcus's expression softened as he looked at his wife's obvious emotion. But then I saw him glance toward his friends, saw the subtle eye roll that suggested Elena's sentimentality was just another example of her unsophisticated background. The blanket was lovely, his expression seemed to say, but hardly comparable to the practical gifts that actually cost something. That's when I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to reveal its contents. The envelope was thick, official-looking, the kind that law firms use for important documents. I debated whether this was the appropriate time and place, but Marcus's casual cruelty had made my decision for me. "Elena, sweetheart," I said, standing up and crossing the circle to hand her the envelope. "This is actually your real gift. The blanket was just something extra." The room quieted as Elena took the envelope, her brow furrowing at the formal appearance of whatever I'd given her. Marcus leaned closer, his curiosity apparently overriding his earlier dismissiveness. I could see him trying to read the return address, trying to make sense of why his simple factory worker mother-in-law would have anything to do with legal documents. "Go ahead and open it," I encouraged, settling back into my chair and trying to appear calmer than I felt. This moment had been months in the making, the culmination of decisions I'd wrestled with since the day Elena had announced her engagement to a man who'd never bothered to ask about my life before he'd entered hers. Elena's fingers fumbled with the envelope's seal, and I could see the confusion in her eyes as she pulled out the first document. It was official letterhead from Morrison, Walsh & Associates, the law firm that had been handling my family's affairs for the past 15 years. The document was dense with legal language, but the number at the top was clear enough that even Marcus would be able to understand its significance. "I don't understand," Elena said, her voice small and uncertain. "Mom, what is this?" Marcus had gone very still beside her, his earlier smugness replaced by something that looked like shock. He was staring at the document in Elena's hands as if it might disappear if he blinked, his mouth slightly open as he processed what he was seeing. "It's your inheritance, honey," I said gently. "Your father left a trust fund when he died, and I've been managing it for you until you turned 25 or got married, whichever came first. Since you'll be 27 next month, and you're married now, it's time for you to know about it." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the background music seemed to have stopped as everyone processed what I'd just said. Elena's father, the man she'd never known because he'd died in a construction accident when she was 2 years old, had apparently left behind more than just memories and a stack of unpaid medical bills. $50 million, Elena read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, this says $50 million. I nodded, watching as Marcus's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Disbelief, confusion, calculation, and finally a dawning horror as he realized the implications of what he'd been saying about the woman who'd apparently been hiding a fortune for the past 25 years. "Your father wasn't just a construction worker," I continued, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. "He was the owner of Bennett Construction, one of the largest contracting companies in the state. When he died, the business was sold, and the proceeds were put into a trust for you. I've been the trustee all these years, making sure the money was invested properly and would be there when you needed it." Elena was crying now, clutching the documents against her chest as if they might provide some connection to the father she'd never known. But Marcus looked like he was about to be sick, his face pale, and his hand shaking as he reached for the papers she'd dropped. "This can't be real," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Elena, your mom works at a textile factory. She drives a 15-year-old Honda. She shops at thrift stores and clips coupons and—" His voice trailed off as he encountered page after page of financial documents, investment statements, and legal filings that painted a picture completely different from the one he'd constructed in his mind. I'd let him believe what he wanted to believe about me, about my circumstances, about my ability to provide for my daughter. It had been a test of his character, a way to see whether he would love Elena for who she was, rather than what she might bring to the marriage. Based on his behavior over the past 3 years, I'd learned everything I needed to know about the kind of man he really was. "I work at the factory because I like the work," I said calmly. "I drive an old car because it's reliable and paid for. I shop at thrift stores because I've never seen the point in waste. But that doesn't mean I don't have choices, Marcus. It just means I make different choices than you might expect." The truth was more complicated than I was willing to explain in front of a room full of baby shower guests. Yes, Thomas had left money, but not the kind of generational wealth the trust documents suggested. What had started as a modest life insurance payout and the sale of a small construction business had grown into something extraordinary through years of careful investment and compound interest. I'd had help, more help than I'd ever told Elena about. Thomas's older brother had been a financial advisor who'd taken pity on his brother's widow and infant daughter. Under his guidance, every penny I could spare had gone into investments that had performed better than anyone could have predicted. Tech stocks in the 90s, real estate before the boom, careful diversification that had turned a few $100,000 into tens of millions over the course of 25 years. But I'd lived as if none of it existed, as if every dollar I earned at the factory was all we had. Elena had grown up believing we were barely getting by, that her college fund came from my overtime shifts and careful budgeting. She'd worked part-time throughout school, not because she had to, but because I'd let her believe it was necessary. It had been a choice born of love and fear, a mother's desire to raise a daughter who understood the value of work and sacrifice, who wouldn't take anything for granted, who would become the kind of person who could handle wealth responsibly when the time came. Watching Marcus's reaction to the revelation, I knew I'd made the right decision. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that I'd never heard from him before. "Baby, why didn't you know about this? How could your mom not tell you?" My daughter was still processing the information, still trying to reconcile the mother she'd known with the woman who'd apparently been sitting on a fortune for her entire life. The hurt in her eyes was real, and it cut me deeper than Marcus's earlier insults had. This was the moment I'd been dreading for years, the moment when I'd have to explain why I'd chosen deception over transparency, why I'd let her struggle and worry and work when I could have made her life so much easier. "Because I wanted you to become the person you are," I said softly, reaching across the space between us to take her hand. "I wanted you to work for your nursing degree and value your education and understand what it means to earn something yourself. If you'd known about the money, would you have pushed yourself the way you did? Would you have developed the strength and independence that makes you so incredible?" Elena squeezed my hand, her tears flowing freely now. Around us, the baby shower guests sat in stunned silence, witnessing a family drama that was far more complicated than anyone had expected when they'd come to celebrate a pregnancy. Marcus was still poring over the documents, his face growing paler with each page. I could almost see the calculations running through his mind, the realization that he'd married into the kind of wealth he'd always assumed was beyond his reach. The understanding that his comments about cheap gifts and factory workers had been directed at a woman who could buy and sell his family's assets without making a dent in her portfolio. There's more, I said, pulling another envelope from my purse. This one was smaller, less official looking, but the contents were perhaps more significant than the trust documents. Elena, I need you to understand something about your husband before you become financially responsible for him. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me with what might have been the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all day. Fear.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Real honest fear of a woman he'd systematically underestimated for the past 3 years. What's that supposed to mean? He demanded, his voice sharp with defensive anger. What are you trying to do here, Margaret? I'd been waiting for this moment for months, ever since the conversation I'd overheard between Marcus and his college roommate about Elena's limited prospects and how he'd have to manage expectations about their lifestyle once the baby came. Since the phone calls I'd accidentally answered when he'd been discussing his wife's family background with his friends, laughing about how he'd married down, but Elena was pretty enough to make it worthwhile. It means I've been watching you, Marcus, I said calmly, listening to you. Learning about the kind of man you really are when you think no one important is paying attention. I opened the second envelope and pulled out a small stack of photographs, nothing dramatic, nothing that would destroy his life, but images that captured the essence of his character in ways that legal documents never could. Marcus at a bar with his coworkers, loudly complaining about having to attend Elena's family gatherings. Marcus at his bachelor party, making jokes about how he'd trade up once he'd established himself in his career. But the most damning evidence wasn't in the photographs. It was in the audio recording I'd made 3 weeks earlier when Marcus had brought a coworker home for dinner and they'd spent the evening in our garage, drinking beer and talking about their futures. Elena's great, I'd heard him say, his voice slightly slurred from alcohol, but her family situation is going to be a drag. Her mom's going to be our responsibility eventually, you know. Factory workers don't exactly have retirement plans. I'm already planning how to handle it when she gets too old to work. The callousness of it had taken my breath away. This was the man my daughter had chosen to build a life with, someone who saw her mother as a future burden rather than a person who'd sacrificed everything to give Elena opportunities. Someone who was already planning how to manage the inconvenience of caring for the woman who'd raised his wife. You recorded me. Marcus's voice was rising now, attracting attention from the other guests who'd been pretending not to listen to our increasingly tense conversation. That's illegal. You can't just spy on people in their own home. It's my home, I reminded him gently. Elena is still on the lease, and actually under state law I'm allowed to record conversations that take place in my own residence. I had my lawyer check before I decided to keep the evidence. Elena was looking back and forth between us, her confusion obvious as she tried to understand what was happening to her baby shower, to her marriage, to the life she'd thought she understood. The gift opening had stopped completely, and I could see some of the guests beginning to gather their things, sensing that this had moved beyond normal family drama into something much more serious. Marcus, Elena said quietly, what is she talking about? What evidence? I made the decision to spare Elena the details of her husband's private conversations about her family. She was 7 months pregnant and didn't need the stress of learning about every cruel thing he'd said about the people she loved. But I also couldn't let this moment pass without giving her the information she needed to make informed decisions about her future. Your husband has some interesting opinions about your family background, I said carefully. About what kind of life he expected to have with a woman whose mother is a factory worker. About how he planned to handle the burden of eventually taking care of me when I got too old to support myself. Marcus's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Those were private conversations between friends. Everyone talks about in-laws. Everyone complains about family obligations. That doesn't mean anything. It means everything, I said firmly. It means you've spent 3 years lying to my daughter about who you really are and what you really think of her family. It means you've been planning a future based on assumptions that were completely wrong, and now you have to figure out how to live with the reality that the woman you've been dismissing as a burden is actually the one with the power to secure your family's future. The weight of the revelation was settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Elena's friends were exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with being witnesses to such a personal family crisis. Marcus's friends had moved closer together, probably preparing to make a strategic exit from what had become a very awkward situation. But I wasn't finished. The trust fund documents were just the beginning of what Elena needed to know about her inheritance and her options. There were decisions to be made about how the money would be managed, about whether Marcus would have any legal claim to assets that predated their marriage, about what kind of financial future Elena wanted to build for her child. Elena, I said, turning my attention back to my daughter who was still clutching the trust documents against her chest. The money comes with conditions. Legal protections that your father's brother built into the trust to make sure it would always benefit you and your children, not anyone who might try to manipulate you because of your wealth. Marcus's expression shifted again, this time to something that looked like genuine panic. What kind of conditions? I smiled for the first time since the gift opening had begun. This was the part I'd been looking forward to explaining, the part where years of careful legal planning would finally pay off in ways that Thomas's brother could never have anticipated when he'd structured the trust. The kind that protect Elena from fortune hunters, I said sweetly. The kind that ensure her inheritance can never be claimed by a spouse who married her under false pretenses. The kind that give her complete control over how the money is used and who benefits from it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what I'd just told him. Around us, the baby shower guests were beginning to pack up leftover cake and collect gift bags, sensing that the celebration had reached its natural conclusion. But Elena remained frozen in her chair, the trust documents spread across her lap like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Mom," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain, "I need to understand something. If you've had this money all along, why did I work so hard? Why did I take out student loans and work part-time and stress about tuition payments if you could have just paid for everything?" It was the question I'd been preparing to answer for years, the moment when I'd have to justify the choices I'd made as a mother, the deception I'd maintained for the sake of what I believed was Elena's best interests. Looking at my daughter's face, seeing the confusion and hurt in her eyes, I wondered if I'd been wrong to keep the truth from her for so long. "Because I wanted you to become the kind of person who could handle this responsibility," I said honestly. "I wanted you to understand the value of work and education and independence before you had to make decisions about millions of dollars. I wanted you to choose a husband who loved you for who you are, not what you might inherit." Elena's tears had stopped, but her expression remained troubled. "But Marcus did choose me for who I am. He doesn't even know about the money until today." I looked across the room at Marcus, who was now huddled with his friends near the exit, their voices low and urgent as they discussed something that was clearly important to them. His body language had changed completely since the revelation of the trust fund, his earlier confidence replaced by what looked like desperate calculation. "Elena," I said gently, "I need you to pay attention to your husband's behavior over the next few weeks. Watch how he treats you now that he knows about the money. Listen to how he talks about your future together, about the decisions you'll make as a family. See if the man you married is the same person when he thinks you're worth $50 million. It was advice born from my own experience, from years of watching people's behavior change when they learned about financial opportunities. I'd seen it in my own extended family when Thomas's estate had been settled, the sudden interest in maintaining relationships with the widow and her baby daughter. I'd seen it in the attitudes of Elena's teachers and neighbors when they'd heard rumors about insurance money and business sales. People revealed their true nature when money entered the equation, and I had a feeling that Marcus's response to Elena's inheritance would tell us everything we needed to know about the kind of man he really was underneath his polished exterior. The baby shower officially ended with awkward hugs and promises to call soon, but I knew that most of Elena's friends would spend the drive home discussing what they'd witnessed rather than the upcoming arrival of her baby. It wasn't the celebration any of us had planned, but it had accomplished something more important than gift-giving and party games. Elena now knew the truth about her inheritance, about her family's financial situation, and about her husband's real opinions regarding her background. What she chose to do with that information would determine the course of her future and the kind of life she wanted to build for her child. As we cleaned up the streamers and gathered the gifts, I watched Marcus's behavior carefully. He'd made several phone calls during the cleanup process, his voice animated in ways I'd never heard before. He'd also approached Elena multiple times with suggestions about financial planning and investment strategies, as if he'd suddenly become an expert on managing wealth. The transformation was already beginning, just as I'd predicted it would. The man who'd spent 3 years treating me like an embarrassing relative was now very interested in building a closer relationship with his wife's family. The husband who'd complained about family obligations was suddenly full of ideas about how we could all benefit from Elena's inheritance. But I'd spent 25 years preparing for this moment, and I had plans that Marcus couldn't possibly anticipate. Plans that would test his character in ways he'd never experienced, that would reveal whether he was capable of loving Elena for herself, or whether his feelings had been fundamentally altered by the discovery of her wealth. The real test was just beginning, and I intended to document every moment of it with the same careful attention I'd used to build and protect Elena's inheritance. Because $50 million was just the starting point of what Elena would need to understand about power, responsibility, and the true nature of the people around her. Marcus had called me a cheap gift giver, had dismissed me as a simple factory worker who didn't understand quality or value. But the gift I'd given my daughter that day was worth more than money. It was the gift of truth, the gift of clear vision, the gift of understanding exactly who she'd married and what kind of future she wanted to build for herself and her child. The baby shower was over, but the real celebration of Elena's inheritance was just beginning, and I had every intention of making sure she understood exactly what she'd received and what it meant for the rest of her life. The week following the baby shower passed in a blur of phone calls, financial meetings, and careful observation of how dramatically Marcus's behavior had shifted since learning about Elena's inheritance. I'd expected changes, but the speed and thoroughness of his transformation caught me off guard. The man who'd spent 3 years treating family gatherings like social obligations suddenly wanted to schedule weekly dinners to get to know each other better. Elena called me Tuesday morning, her voice thick with exhaustion and confusion. She'd barely slept since the revelation, spending most of her nights staring at the trust documents and trying to reconcile the mother she'd known with the woman who'd been managing millions of dollars in secret. The pregnancy hormones weren't helping her emotional state, and I could hear the strain in every word she spoke. "Marcus has been different," she said without preamble when I answered the phone. "Ever since Sunday, it's like he's become this completely different person. He keeps wanting to talk about financial advisors and investment portfolios and tax strategies. Yesterday he spent 3 hours researching wealth management firms online." I wasn't surprised. Marcus struck me as the type of man who would immediately begin treating Elena's inheritance as a problem he needed to solve, a resource he needed to optimize, rather than understanding it as part of her family history that required sensitivity and respect. His insurance adjuster background had probably taught him to see financial assets as numbers on spreadsheets rather than emotional legacies tied to love and loss. "How are you feeling about everything?" I asked, settling into my kitchen chair with my morning coffee. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Henderson working in her garden next door, the same routine she'd maintained for the 15 years I'd lived in this house. Some things stayed constant even when everything else shifted. "Overwhelmed," Elena admitted. "Grateful, but also angry. Mom, I understand why you did what you did, but I spent so many nights lying awake worrying about money. About whether I could afford textbooks or whether we'd be able to pay for the baby's medical expenses. I ate ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights a week during nursing school because I thought we couldn't afford anything else." The pain in her voice cut through me like a blade. This was the conversation I'd been dreading for 25 years, the moment when I'd have to account for every deliberate hardship I'd allowed her to experience, every worry I could have eliminated with a single phone call to the bank. The guilt I'd carried about my choices felt heavier now that Elena was pregnant, now that she was experiencing the vulnerability that came with being responsible for another life. "I know," I said quietly. "I know it was hard, and I know there were times when you suffered because of my decisions. But Elena, look at who you became because of those experiences. Look at your work ethic, your compassion for patients who struggle financially, your appreciation for the opportunities you earned through your own effort." "But what if I'd failed?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. What if I'd dropped out of nursing school because the stress was too much? What if I'd made different choices because I thought I couldn't afford better options? It was a fair question, one I'd wrestled with countless times during her teenage years when I'd watched her stress about college applications and scholarship requirements. The truth was that I'd never been as hands-off as she believed. Behind the scenes, I'd been monitoring her academic progress, ready to intervene if she'd truly been in danger of failing. I'd had backup plans and safety nets that she'd never known about. Ways to help without revealing the source of that help. I was watching, I told her, every step of the way. If you'd truly been in danger of failing, I would have found ways to help that wouldn't have compromised the lessons you needed to learn. Anonymous scholarships, unexpected grants, family friends who needed tutoring and could pay well for it. I was never going to let you actually fail, Elena. I just needed you to believe that failure was possible. She was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Marcus's voice in the background, asking Elena something about meeting times and appointment schedules. Even from my kitchen, I could hear the urgency in his tone, the barely contained excitement that had been his dominant emotion since Sunday. He wants us to meet with a financial planner this afternoon, Elena said, her voice muffled as if she'd covered the phone with her hand. He's already called 3 different firms and scheduled consultations for this week. He keeps talking about maximizing our potentials and strategic asset allocation. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same protective instinct that had guided my parenting decisions for the past 26 years. Marcus was moving too fast, pushing too hard, treating Elena's inheritance like a business opportunity rather than a family legacy that deserved careful consideration. The speed of his response told me everything I needed to know about his priorities and his character. Elena, I said carefully, I need you to understand something important about the trust structure. The money isn't actually yours yet, not completely. There are conditions that need to be met, processes that need to be followed, decisions that can't be made quickly or carelessly. This wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. Thomas's brother had built flexibility into the trust that would allow Elena to access the funds whenever she chose, but he'd also included provisions that would protect the money from impulsive decisions or external pressure. As the trustee, I still had significant control over how and when the assets were distributed, and I intended to use that control to ensure Elena's long-term security. What kind of conditions? Marcus's voice came through the phone clearly now, suggesting he'd moved closer to Elena, or that she'd put the call on speaker. His tone was sharp with anxiety, the voice of a man who'd spent the week calculating how this windfall would change his life and was now discovering there might be obstacles to his plans. The kind that require careful consideration and legal oversight. I replied, keeping my voice pleasant but firm. Thomas's brother was a financial advisor, Marcus. He understood how sudden wealth could destroy families if it wasn't handled properly. The trust includes safeguards to prevent exactly the kind of rushed decision-making that you're suggesting. I could hear Marcus muttering something under his breath, probably complaints about legal complications and bureaucratic delays. But Elena's voice cut through his frustration with a question that went straight to the heart of what was happening to her marriage. Mom, are you saying you don't trust Marcus to help me make these decisions? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Elena was asking me to state explicitly what I'd been implying through my actions and my warnings, to put words to the concerns that had been growing stronger with every conversation I'd had with her since the baby shower. She was asking me to choose between diplomatic silence and honest assessment of her husband's character. I'm saying I don't know Marcus well enough to trust him with decisions that will affect your entire future, I said carefully. I'm saying that someone who's known about this money for less than a week shouldn't be making appointments with financial planners without understanding the legal and emotional complexities involved. Marcus's response was immediate and defensive. Margaret, with all due respect, Elena is my wife. These are decisions we need to make together as a family. You can't keep controlling her life just because you've been keeping secrets for 25 years. The accusation stung because it contained elements of truth. I had been controlling Elena's life in ways she hadn't understood, making decisions about her future without her knowledge or consent. But I'd also been protecting her from exactly the kind of pressure Marcus was now applying, the assumption that wealth was something to be managed and optimized rather than something to be understood and respected. "You're right," I said, surprising both of them with my agreement. "Elena is an adult, and these are ultimately her decisions to make. But they're decisions that will affect her for the rest of her life, and they deserve more consideration than a week of internet research and hastily scheduled meetings." Elena's voice was small when she spoke again. "What do you think I should do?" It was the question I'd been hoping she'd ask, the opening I'd been waiting for to share the plan I'd been developing since the moment I'd decided to reveal the trust fund. Over the past 25 years, I'd had countless conversations with financial advisors, estate attorneys, and wealth management specialists about how to handle this exact situation. I'd learned from other families who'd navigated sudden wealth, studied the mistakes that led to destroyed relationships and squandered fortunes. "I think you should take time to understand what you've inherited before you make any decisions about how to manage it," I said. "I think you should learn about your father's life and his family's history, about how this money was earned and why he wanted you to have it. I think you should consider what kind of life you want to build for your child, and how this inheritance fits into those plans." Marcus's frustration was audible in his breathing, the heavy sighs of a man who wanted action rather than contemplation. But Elena seemed to be considering my words seriously, weighing them against the pressure she was feeling to make immediate decisions about her financial future. "How long are we talking about?" she asked. "How much time do you think I need to figure all this out?" The question revealed how much Elena still didn't understand about wealth management and long-term financial planning. She was thinking in terms of weeks or months, the time frame that Marcus had been pushing for immediate action. But the kind of decisions she was facing required years of careful consideration, the development of expertise and wisdom that couldn't be rushed. "Elena, this isn't something you figure out and then you're done," I explained gently. "Managing this kind of wealth is a lifelong responsibility. There will always be new decisions to make, new opportunities to evaluate, new risks to consider. The goal isn't to solve the problem quickly. The goal is to build the knowledge and systems you'll need to handle these responsibilities for the rest of your life." I could hear Marcus pacing in the background, his footsteps echoing through what sounded like their apartment's hardwood floors. The sound reminded me of a caged animal, restless and frustrated by constraints he couldn't control. It was exactly the kind of behavior I'd expected from someone whose plans had been disrupted by complications he hadn't anticipated. "Look," Marcus said, his voice closer to the phone again, "I understand that this is complicated, Margaret. But Elena and I aren't children. We're capable of making intelligent decisions about our future, and frankly, some of these decisions are time-sensitive. Tax implications, investment opportunities, estate planning considerations. The longer we wait, the more money we could be losing." His words revealed everything I needed to know about his mindset and his priorities. Marcus was thinking like an insurance adjuster evaluating a claim, focused on maximizing immediate returns, rather than building sustainable long-term security. He was treating Elena's inheritance like a windfall to be optimized, rather than a legacy to be honored and protected. "Marcus," I said, letting a slight edge creep into my voice, "Elena isn't losing money by taking time to make informed decisions. The trust has been growing steadily for 25 years without any input from either of you. It will continue to grow while Elena learns what she needs to know to manage it responsibly." The silence that followed suggested I'd hit a nerve, challenged an assumption that Marcus had been holding about his role in managing Elena's inheritance. I could almost hear him recalculating, trying to figure out how to position himself as indispensable to the process, when the reality was that the money had been doing just fine without him. Elena's voice broke the tension. "I want to meet with your lawyer," she said. "The one who's been handling the trust. I want to understand exactly what Dad set up, and what options I have before I make any other decisions." It was exactly what I'd been hoping she'd say, the first step toward taking control of her inheritance in a thoughtful, informed way. Elena was naturally cautious, the kind of person who researched major purchases for weeks before making a decision. Her impulse to seek expert guidance before acting was a good sign that she might be able to handle wealth responsibly. "I'll call Jonathan this afternoon and set up a meeting," I promised. "He's been wanting to meet you for years. He knew your father, Elena, He can tell you stories about Thomas that I've never shared, help you understand who he was and what he wanted for your future. Marcus's reaction was immediate and negative. We don't need to complicate this with emotional appeals and family history, Elena. This is about financial planning, not storytelling. We need practical advice from someone who understands current market conditions and tax law. The dismissiveness in his tone made my hands clench around my coffee cup. Marcus was treating Elena's connection to her father like an inconvenience, something to be managed efficiently rather than explored meaningfully. He had no understanding of how important it was for Elena to feel connected to the source of her inheritance, to understand the values and intentions that had shaped her father's decisions about her future. Actually, Marcus, Elena said quietly, I think I do want to hear those stories. I've wondered about my dad my entire life. If Mr. Morrison knew him, if he can help me understand who he was and what he wanted for me, that feels important. I smiled despite the tension of the conversation. Elena's instincts were sound, her priorities properly ordered. She understood intuitively that inheriting $50 million was about more than money, that it carried emotional and spiritual weight that needed to be acknowledged and respected. The appointment with Jonathan Morrison was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at his downtown law office. I arrived early, wanting to brief him on the family dynamics and Marcus's behavior before Elena and her husband joined us. Jonathan had been handling my family's affairs for 15 years, ever since Thomas's brother had retired and recommended him as his successor. He understood the complexities of the trust structure and the delicate balance between protection and empowerment that Thomas's brother had tried to create. How did Elena react to learning about the inheritance? Jonathan asked as we settled into his conference room. He was a man in his early 60s, with the kind of quiet competence that came from decades of helping families navigate complex financial situations. His office walls were lined with family photos and thank you letters from clients, evidence of the personal relationships he built with the people he served. Better than I expected, I admitted. She's hurt that I kept it secret for so long, but she understands why I made that choice. She wants to learn about her father and understand his intentions. She's asking the right questions. Jonathan nodded approvingly. And the husband? I sighed, thinking about Marcus's behavior over the past week, his impatience with process and his focus on immediate action. He's treating this like a business opportunity rather than a family legacy. He's pushing for quick decisions and immediate access. He scheduled meetings with financial planners before Elena even understood what she'd inherited. That's not uncommon, Jonathan said gently. Sudden wealth brings out strong reactions in people. Some become paralyzed by the responsibility. Others become obsessed with optimization. The key is helping Elena find her own relationship with the money, independent of outside pressure. Elena and Marcus arrived precisely on time. Elena looking nervous but determined, Marcus carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained research he'd printed from the internet. His handshake was firm, his smile professional, the demeanor of someone preparing for a business negotiation rather than a family meeting. Jonathan began with the history of the trust, explaining how Thomas's construction business had grown from a small residential contractor to one of the region's largest commercial builders. He showed Elena photographs from the company's files, images of her father at construction sites and award ceremonies. Evidence of a successful man who'd built something substantial before his life was cut short. Your father was particularly proud of a low-income housing project he completed just before he died, Jonathan said, pulling out architectural drawings and newspaper clippings. He could have made more money on luxury developments, but he wanted to build homes for families who couldn't afford traditional housing. He said it was more important to house 20 families affordably than to build one mansion for someone who already had plenty. Elena studied the photographs with obvious emotion, seeing her father's face for the first time in images that showed him as a successful adult rather than the young construction worker she'd imagined. Marcus glanced at the pictures politely but quickly turned his attention to the financial documents Jonathan had spread across the conference table. These are impressive projects, Marcus said. But what we really need to understand is the current value of the trust and the options for accessing those funds. Elena's pregnant, we're looking at significant medical expenses, and we want to make sure we're maximizing the growth potential of these assets. Jonathan's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd encountered this type of response before. He pulled out a thick binder containing the most recent trust statements, account summaries that showed the growth of Elena's inheritance over the past quarter century. The current value is approximately $52 million, Jonathan said calmly. The trust generates roughly $2.5 million annually in dividends and interest, most of which has been reinvested over the years. Elena, as the beneficiary, can choose to take distributions from the principal or to live on the income while preserving the capital for future generations. Marcus's eyes widened at the annual income figure. $2.5 million per year was more than he'd imagined possible, enough to support a lifestyle he'd only dreamed about. I could see him calculating, planning, imagining how this money would transform every aspect of their lives. So Elena could take, say, $5 million right now, without significantly impacting the long-term growth of the trust. Marcus asked, his voice carefully casual as if the question had just occurred to him. Jonathan looked at Elena, rather than Marcus when he answered. Elena can take whatever she wants, whenever she wants it, but the beauty of this trust structure is that it's designed to generate wealth indefinitely if managed properly. Your father wanted to ensure that his great-grandchildren would have the same opportunities that this money is providing for you. Elena was quiet, absorbing the magnitude of what she'd inherited and the responsibility that came with it. She'd never thought beyond her own immediate needs, never considered herself as part of a generational chain of wealth that could continue indefinitely if she made wise choices. What would you recommend, she asked Jonathan, if you were in my position, how would you approach this? It was the right question, the one that demonstrated Elena's willingness to seek guidance rather than make impulsive decisions. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, considering his response carefully. He'd had this conversation with dozens of clients over the years, people who'd inherited significant wealth and needed to navigate the transition from scarcity thinking to abundance management. I'd recommend starting slowly, he said. Take enough to eliminate any immediate financial stress, to pay off debts and establish a comfortable emergency fund. But leave the majority of the principal invested, while you take time to understand what wealth means for your life and your family. Marcus shifted impatiently in his chair. How much is enough in your opinion? What kind of numbers are we talking about? Jonathan's attention remained focused on Elena. That depends entirely on Elena's goals and values. Some beneficiaries are comfortable living on the trust's annual income, which would currently support a very comfortable lifestyle without touching the principal. Others prefer to take larger distributions to fund specific projects or investments. The annual income alone would be life-changing, Elena said quietly. $2.5 million a year is more money than I ever imagined having. We could pay off our student loans, buy a house, set up college funds for the baby, and still have more left over than most families make in a decade. Her perspective was exactly what I'd hoped to hear, evidence that Elena understood the transformative power of the inheritance without losing sight of reasonable proportions. But Marcus's expression suggested he was thinking on a much larger scale, imagining possibilities that went far beyond debt elimination and home ownership. But we could also take a larger distribution and invest it ourselves, Marcus said. Real estate development, business partnerships, high-growth investments that could potentially multiply the money faster than traditional trust management. Jonathan's response was measured but firm. Those strategies are certainly possible, but they also carry significant risks. Your father's brother chose conservative investment approaches specifically to preserve capital over time. The trust has grown consistently for 25 years without major losses because it prioritizes stability over aggressive growth. I watched Elena's face as she processed the competing philosophies being presented to her. Jonathan was advocating for the patient, conservative approach that had successfully protected and grown her inheritance for decades. Marcus was pushing for more aggressive strategies that could potentially generate higher returns, but also carried the risk of significant losses. I think I want to start with Jonathan's approach, Elena said finally. Take enough to eliminate our immediate financial stress, but leave most of the money invested the way it has been. I'm not comfortable making major investment decisions when I don't really understand how any of this works yet. Marcus's disappointment was obvious, though he tried to hide it behind a supportive smile. Of course, honey, whatever makes you comfortable. We can always revisit these decisions as we learn more about our options. But I could hear the underlying tension in his voice, the frustration of someone whose plans had been delayed, rather than abandoned. Marcus wasn't giving up on his vision of immediate wealth and dramatic lifestyle changes. He was simply accepting that he'd need to be more patient and strategic in pursuing those goals. The meeting continued for another hour, as Jonathan explained the legal mechanics of trust distributions, the tax implications of different withdrawal strategies, and the ongoing responsibilities that would come with managing significant wealth. Elena asked thoughtful questions about charitable giving, educational funding, and long-term financial planning. Marcus focused primarily on investment returns, tax optimization, and liquidity options. As we prepared to leave, Jonathan handed Elena a business card for a wealth management firm that specialized in working with trust beneficiaries. These people understand the unique challenges of inherited wealth, he explained. They can help you develop financial literacy and decision-making skills at whatever pace feels comfortable for you. Elena tucked the card into her purse, but Marcus immediately pulled out his phone to research the firm online. His behavior had become predictable over the past week. Any new information about Elena's inheritance triggered immediate research and planning, as if he were afraid opportunities would disappear if he didn't act quickly enough. "Thank you for everything," Elena said to Jonathan as we shook hands in the lobby. "This has been overwhelming, but it helps to understand what Dad wanted for me and how the trust is designed to work. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become." Jonathan replied, "Take your time with these decisions, Elena. The money has waited 25 years for you. It can wait a little longer while you figure out how you want to use it." The drive home was quiet, Elena lost in thought while Marcus made phone calls about scheduling additional meetings with the wealth management firm. I could see Elena processing everything she'd learned about her father, about the business he'd built, about the values that had shaped his decisions about her future. The inheritance was becoming real to her not just as money, but as a connection to a parent she'd never known. "Mom," she said as I pulled into her apartment complex, "I want to see Dad's construction sites. The buildings he created. I want to understand what kind of work he did, and why it mattered to him." It was exactly the response I'd hoped for, evidence that Elena was developing a relationship with her inheritance that went beyond its financial value. She was beginning to see herself as part of a story that started before her birth, as the continuation of her father's legacy, rather than just the recipient of his money. "I'd love to show you those buildings," I said. "We can make a day of it this weekend. Some of them are still standing, still housing families that Thomas wanted to help." Marcus looked up from his phone, clearly not understanding why Elena would want to spend time looking at old construction projects when there were financial decisions to be made. But Elena's face was bright with anticipation, excited about connecting with her father's work in a tangible way. That evening, I sat in my living room reviewing the trust documents and thinking about the conversation we'd had with Jonathan. Elena was asking the right questions and making thoughtful decisions, but Marcus's impatience was concerning. His focus on immediate returns and aggressive investment strategies suggested he didn't understand the long-term thinking that had built and preserved Elena's inheritance. More troubling was his assumption that Elena's decisions about her inheritance were automatically joint marital decisions that he should have equal input on. The prenuptial agreement that Elena had signed before their wedding specifically protected inherited assets from marital property claims, but Marcus either didn't understand that distinction or was choosing to ignore it. I'd spent 25 years preparing Elena to handle wealth responsibly, but I'd never anticipated that her husband would become the primary threat to that preparation. Marcus's transformation since learning about the inheritance suggested that Elena would need to navigate not just the complexities of wealth management but also the challenge of maintaining her marriage to someone whose feelings about her had been fundamentally altered by money. The real test of Marcus's character was just beginning, and I intended to document every aspect of his behavior as Elena made decisions about her future. Because $50 million was more than just financial security. It was power, influence and freedom to choose the kind of life Elena wanted to build for herself and her child. The question now was whether Marcus would support Elena's journey toward financial independence, or whether he would try to control and manipulate her decisions for his own benefit. Based on his behavior over the past week, I had my suspicions about which direction he would choose. But Elena was stronger than Marcus realized, more capable of independent thinking than he'd given her credit for. The woman who'd earned her nursing degree through her own determination and hard work wasn't going to be easily manipulated by someone who thought wealth was something to be optimized rather than something to be stewarded responsibly. The inheritance had changed everything, but it had also revealed everything. Now Elena would have to decide what kind of future she wanted to build, and whether Marcus would be part of that future or an obstacle to it. 3 weeks after the meeting with Jonathan Morrison, Elena called me at 6 in the morning, her voice shaking with exhaustion and something that sounded like fear. She'd been awake most of the night, she said, because Marcus had come home from another networking event with ideas that made her stomach turn. He'd been attending these events almost nightly since learning about the inheritance, meeting with people he claimed were high-net-worth individuals who could help them leverage their assets effectively. "Mom, he wants to invest $15 million in some kind of cryptocurrency mining operation," Elena said without preamble. "He brought home paperwork last night and spread it across our kitchen table like he was planning a business presentation. He says we could triple our money in 18 months. I felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had been growing stronger with each of Marcus's increasingly reckless suggestions. Over the past month, he'd proposed everything from luxury real estate flipping to private equity investments in companies he couldn't adequately explain. Each scheme promised astronomical returns with minimal risk, classic warning signs of either fraud or Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth preservation actually worked. "Did you tell him you weren't interested?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on the tremor in Elena's voice. "I tried," she whispered. "But he got so angry, Mom. He started yelling about how I was being manipulated by you and Jonathan, how we were missing opportunities that could set our family up for generations. He said I was being naive, and that someone needed to make smart decisions for our future." The controlling language wasn't surprising, but hearing it directed at my daughter made my hands clench around the phone. Marcus was escalating his pressure tactics, moving from persuasion to intimidation as Elena continued to resist his investment schemes. The pattern was textbook manipulation: create urgency, dismiss alternative opinions, and position himself as the only person capable of protecting Elena's interests. "Elena, where are you now?" I asked, hearing traffic noise in the background that suggested she wasn't at home. "Sitting in my car outside the hospital," she admitted. "I couldn't be in the apartment with him this morning. He kept showing me charts and graphs about cryptocurrency returns, telling me we were losing thousands of dollars every day we waited to invest. I finally told him I needed time to think, and he said I was being emotional and making decisions based on fear instead of logic." The irony of Marcus accusing Elena of emotional decision-making while he chased get-rich-quick schemes was almost laughable, but the distress in my daughter's voice made it impossible to find humor in the situation. Elena was 8 months pregnant, dealing with the physical and emotional challenges of preparing for motherhood while trying to navigate a marriage that was deteriorating under the pressure of sudden wealth. "Come over for breakfast," I said immediately. "We need to talk about what's happening and what options you have for protecting yourself and the baby." Elena arrived 20 minutes later, looking pale and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy fatigue. She'd lost weight despite being in her final trimester, stress eating away at her appetite and energy. Marcus's relentless pursuit of investment opportunities was taking a visible toll on her health and emotional well-being. I made her scrambled eggs and toast, the comfort foods she'd loved as a child, while she settled into the kitchen chair where we'd had so many important conversations over the years. Through the window, the morning sun was just beginning to illuminate my garden, the same view that had provided stability and continuity through every crisis of Elena's childhood. "Tell me everything," I said gently, sitting across from her with my own cup of coffee. "Not just about last night, but about how Marcus has been behaving since the inheritance became real." Elena's story unfolded in painful detail over the next hour. Marcus had quit his insurance job the week after learning about the trust fund, claiming he needed to focus full-time on wealth management and investment research. He'd purchased expensive financial software, subscribed to investment newsletters, and began attending seminars about real estate development and private equity opportunities. More concerning was his social transformation. Marcus had always been image-conscious, but his concern with appearances had intensified dramatically since Elena's inheritance became known. He'd bought new clothes, leased a luxury car, and started frequenting restaurants and clubs where he could network with what he called serious investors. The man who'd once criticized my modest gifts was now spending thousands of dollars on a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford. He's using our joint credit cards for everything, Elena said, her voice thick with worry. The car lease, the clothes, the restaurant bills, the seminar fees. When I asked him about it, he said it was an investment in our future, that we needed to look successful to attract the right kind of business opportunities. I felt my heart sink as I recognized the classic pattern of someone living beyond their means in anticipation of future wealth. Marcus was spending money he didn't have, based on investments that didn't exist, creating financial pressure that would only increase his desperation to access Elena's inheritance quickly. How much debt has he accumulated? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be worse than Elena knew. I'm not sure, she admitted. He says it's all strategic spending and that the numbers will work out once we start seeing returns on our investments. But Mom, we haven't made any investments. The trust is still managed the same way it's been managed for 25 years. Marcus is spending money we don't have on the assumption that I'm going to agree to his investment schemes. The financial recklessness was alarming enough, but what worried me more was the psychological pressure Marcus was creating. Elena was being forced to choose between supporting her husband's increasingly risky financial plans or accepting responsibility for his mounting debts and disappointment. It was a form of emotional blackmail that put Elena in an impossible position. Elena, I said carefully, I need to ask you something important. Has Marcus ever suggested that you have an obligation to support his investment plans because you're married? Has he implied that refusing to risk your inheritance would be selfish or unfair to him? Elena's face crumpled as she nodded. He keeps saying that marriage is a partnership, that my inheritance belongs to both of us now. He says I'm being influenced by people who don't understand our relationship, who want to keep us from building wealth together. He makes me feel like I'm betraying him every time I ask questions about his investment ideas. The manipulation was more sophisticated than I'd given Marcus credit for. He was using Elena's natural desire to be a supportive wife against her instincts for financial caution, framing his risky schemes as tests of her love and commitment. It was a particularly cruel form of emotional abuse, because it exploited Elena's best qualities, her loyalty and generosity, to pressure her into decisions that would ultimately harm her. Your inheritance doesn't belong to Marcus, I said firmly. Legally, ethically, or morally, the prenuptial agreement you signed protects inherited assets from marital property claims. More importantly, your father specifically structured the trust to ensure that you would have independent financial security regardless of your marital circumstances. Elena looked surprised by the emphasis I was placing on her legal independence. But we're married, Mom, shouldn't we be making these decisions together? It was a fair question that went to the heart of how couples should handle financial decision-making. In a healthy marriage, spouses did collaborate on major financial choices, sharing information and working toward mutual goals. But Elena's situation was complicated by the scale of her inheritance and Marcus's increasingly erratic behavior around money. In a normal marriage, yes, I said, but Elena, this isn't a normal situation. You've inherited more money than most people will see in multiple lifetimes. That level of wealth requires specialized knowledge and careful decision-making. It also attracts people who see opportunity rather than love when they look at you. I could see Elena processing my words, considering the possibility that Marcus's feelings about their marriage had been fundamentally altered by money. It was a painful realization for any spouse to contemplate, the idea that love might be conditional on financial circumstances. Do you think Marcus would still want to be married to me if I didn't have the inheritance? She asked quietly. It was the question I'd been hoping she'd ask, the one that would force her to examine Marcus's behavior objectively rather than making excuses for his increasingly troubling choices. But it was also a question that could shatter her faith in her marriage and her judgment about the man she'd chosen to build a life with. I think that's something you'll have to determine for yourself, I said gently. But I think you should pay attention to how Marcus treats you when you disagree with his financial plans. Does he respect your concerns and try to address them, or does he dismiss your feelings and pressure you to comply with his wishes? Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup, as if it might provide answers to questions she'd been avoiding. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with a sadness that made my heart ache for her. He doesn't listen anymore, she said finally. Every conversation becomes about money, about opportunities we're missing, about how my hesitation is holding us back. When I try to talk about the baby or our future as a family, he redirects everything back to investment strategies and financial planning. The transformation Elena was describing was exactly what I'd feared would happen when Marcus learned about the inheritance. The man she'd married had been replaced by someone obsessed with wealth optimization, someone who saw Elena primarily as a gateway to financial opportunities, rather than as a partner deserving respect and consideration. Elena, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand, I want you to consider the possibility that you might need to protect yourself and your inheritance from Marcus's influence. Not permanently, not as punishment, but as a way to create space for clear thinking about your future. Her response was immediate and defensive. I can't leave him, Mom. I'm 8 months pregnant. We're about to have a baby together. Whatever problems we're having, I need to find ways to work through them, not run away from them. I understood Elena's reluctance to consider separation during such a vulnerable time in her life. The idea of single motherhood, especially with a newborn, was terrifying under the best circumstances. Adding the complexities of significant wealth to that scenario made it seem overwhelming. I'm not suggesting you leave Marcus, I clarified. I'm suggesting you take steps to ensure that your inheritance remains protected while you figure out how to handle his behavior. There are legal mechanisms that can limit his access to your trust funds without affecting your marriage directly. Elena looked confused by the distinction I was making. What kind of legal mechanisms? I'd been researching this question for weeks, consulting with Jonathan Morrison and other attorneys about options for protecting Elena's inheritance from Marcus's increasingly reckless financial impulses. The trust structure already provided significant protection, but there were additional steps that could be taken to ensure Marcus couldn't pressure Elena into making irreversible decisions during a period of emotional vulnerability. The trust can be modified to require multiple approvals for large distributions, I explained. Jonathan, as the successor trustee, could require independent financial counseling before any distributions above a certain threshold. We could also establish a cooling-off period for major investment decisions, giving you time to research and consider any proposals
Marcus brings to you.
These weren't punitive measures designed to exclude Marcus from Elena's financial life permanently. They were safeguards meant to slow down the decision-making process and ensure that Elena had access to independent advice before committing to any of Marcus's investment schemes. That sounds like I'd be treating Marcus like a child, Elena said, her voice heavy with guilt. Like I don't trust him to help me make good decisions. The guilt in her voice broke my heart, but it also revealed how effectively Marcus had been manipulating her emotions. Elena was blaming herself for considering protective measures rather than questioning why such measures might be necessary in a healthy marriage. Elena, trust is earned through consistent behavior over time, I said gently. Marcus has been pressuring you to make major financial decisions based on his research from internet seminars and networking events with strangers. He's accumulated debt that he expects your inheritance to cover. He's dismissed your concerns and accused you of being emotional when you ask reasonable questions about his investment proposals. Elena winced at each point I made, recognizing the accuracy of my description even as it pained her to acknowledge Marcus's behavior patterns. She'd been making excuses for him, trying to understand his perspective and accommodate his needs, but the cumulative effect of his pressure tactics was becoming impossible to ignore. I just want our marriage to work, she said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. I love him, Mom. Despite everything that's happened, I still love the man I married. I keep hoping he'll remember who he was before the money changed everything. I moved around the table to wrap my arms around Elena, holding her while she cried for the marriage she'd thought she had, and the future she'd planned before wealth complicated everything. Her pregnancy made the emotional burden even heavier, knowing that her decisions would affect not just her own future but her child's security and well-being. Love doesn't always mean staying, I said softly when her tears began to slow. Sometimes love means protecting yourself and your child from someone whose behavior has become harmful, even if that person is someone you care about deeply. Elena pulled back to look at me, her face streaked with tears but her expression more determined than I'd seen in weeks. What do you think I should do? If you were in my position, what choice would you make? It was the question I'd been dreading because it required me to give advice that could fundamentally alter the course of Elena's life. I could encourage her to fight for her marriage, to find ways to work with Marcus and help him adjust to their new financial circumstances. Or I could encourage her to prioritize her own security and independence, accepting that Marcus might not be capable of handling wealth responsibly. I think you should trust your instincts, I said finally. You're a smart, capable woman who's made good decisions throughout your life. The inheritance doesn't change that. You don't need Marcus's permission to protect your future or your child's future. You don't need to risk $50 million to prove your love for your husband. Elena nodded slowly, processing my words and their implications for her marriage. I could see her beginning to consider possibilities she'd been avoiding, weighing her obligations to Marcus against her responsibilities to herself and her unborn child. Will you help me? She asked. If I decide to put additional protections in place, will you help me navigate the legal requirements and deal with Marcus's reaction? Of course, I said immediately. Whatever you decide, I'll support you completely. But Elena, these have to be your decisions. I can provide advice and assistance, but you're the one who has to live with the consequences of whatever choices you make. We spent the rest of the morning discussing practical steps Elena could take to protect her inheritance while buying time to assess Marcus's behavior more objectively. I called Jonathan Morrison and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon, explaining that Elena needed to modify the trust structure to address urgent security concerns. Jonathan was waiting for us when we arrived at his office, his expression grave as he reviewed the documentation I'd prepared about Marcus's recent financial activities. The debt accumulation, the risky investment proposals, the pressure tactics, the dramatic lifestyle changes, all painted a picture of someone whose judgment had been compromised by the prospect of sudden wealth. This behavior pattern is unfortunately common, Jonathan said, as he studied Marcus's credit card statements and investment seminar materials. We've seen it before with spouses who suddenly gain access to significant wealth. The combination of opportunity and pressure often leads to poor decision-making and relationship strain. Elena listened quietly as Jonathan explained the legal mechanisms available for protecting her inheritance from impulsive decisions. The trust could be restructured to require professional financial counseling before any distributions above $1 million. Elena could also establish an independent board of advisors who would review major investment proposals before she committed to them. These modifications don't prevent you from accessing your inheritance, Jonathan emphasized. They simply ensure that you have independent guidance and time for reflection before making irreversible financial commitments. Elena signed the paperwork that afternoon, creating additional layers of protection around her inheritance while preserving her ultimate authority over how the money was used. The changes wouldn't prevent Marcus from making proposals or participating in financial planning discussions, but they would prevent him from pressuring her into immediate decisions about large sums of money. The drive home was quiet, Elena lost in thought about how to explain the trust modifications to Marcus without triggering the kind of explosive argument that had driven her from their apartment that morning. I suggested she frame the changes as prudent financial planning rather than protective measures, emphasizing the professional guidance aspect rather than the security concerns. He's going to see this as a betrayal, Elena said as we pulled into her apartment complex. He's going to think I'm choosing your advice over his input, that I'm not committed to building wealth together. I understood Elena's concern, but I also knew that Marcus's reaction to reasonable protective measures would reveal everything she needed to know about his true priorities. A loving husband would understand his pregnant wife's desire for professional guidance about managing inherited wealth. Someone more interested in accessing money than protecting his family would react with anger and accusations. His reaction will tell you what you need to know about his motivations, I said gently. If Marcus is truly concerned about your family's financial security, he'll support measures that ensure careful decision-making. If he's more interested in quick access to large amounts of money, he'll try to convince you that protective measures are unnecessary obstacles. Elena nodded, steeling herself for a conversation that would likely determine the future of her marriage. She'd spent weeks trying to accommodate Marcus's increasing demands and pressure tactics, but the trust modifications represented a line she was drawing around her own financial autonomy. That evening, Elena called to tell me about Marcus's reaction to the news about the trust changes. His response had been everything I'd feared and more, confirming my worst suspicions about his transformation since learning about the inheritance. He accused me of sabotaging our marriage, Elena said, her voice flat with exhaustion. He said I was letting you control our financial future because I was too scared to take risks. He called the trust modifications financial infantilization and said I was treating him like he couldn't be trusted with important decisions. Marcus's language revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He was treating Elena's inheritance as marital property that he had equal rights to control, rather than understanding it as her individual asset that required her individual decision-making authority. Did he threaten anything? I asked, concerned about how far Marcus might go to regain control over Elena's financial decisions. He said he was considering divorce, Elena replied quietly. He said he couldn't stay married to someone who didn't trust him enough to make financial decisions together. He made it sound like the trust modifications were evidence that I didn't really love him. The threat of divorce as a response to reasonable financial protections confirmed everything I'd suspected about Marcus's motivations. A husband genuinely concerned about his family's security would never threaten to abandon his pregnant wife because she sought professional guidance about managing inherited wealth. Elena, I said carefully, I need you to understand something important. A man who threatens divorce because his wife wants professional financial advice is not a man who has her best interests at heart. He's someone who sees her inheritance as his opportunity and her caution as an obstacle to his plans. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of Marcus's ultimatum. The man she'd married, the one who'd promised to love and protect her through sickness and health, was now threatening to abandon her during the most vulnerable period of her life because she wouldn't give him unrestricted access to $50 million. I think I need some space to figure things out, Elena said finally. Can I stay with you for a few days? I need to think clearly about what's happening to my marriage and what's best for the baby. Of course, I said immediately. Relief flooding through me that Elena was finally recognizing the need to protect herself from Marcus's increasingly erratic behavior. You can stay as long as you need. We'll figure everything out together. Elena arrived that night with a single suitcase and her maternity medical records, looking like a refugee from her own life. She'd left Marcus at their apartment, still raging about trust modifications and missed opportunities, still convinced that Elena's caution was the only thing standing between them and unlimited wealth. As I helped Elena settle into her old bedroom, the same room where she'd studied for nursing school exams and dreamed about her future, I realized that Marcus had given us an unexpected gift. His threats and ultimatums had revealed his true character more clearly than months of careful observation could have accomplished. Elena now knew exactly what kind of man she'd married, and what kind of father he would be to her child. The question was whether she would have the strength to act on that knowledge, to choose security and independence over the familiar comfort of a marriage that had become emotionally and financially dangerous. The inheritance had changed everything, but it had also clarified everything. Now Elena would have to decide whether she wanted to build a future based on love and mutual respect, or whether she would continue trying to satisfy the demands of someone who saw her primarily as a means to wealth, rather than as a person deserving protection and consideration. Marcus had made his choice clear through his behavior, his threats, and his ultimatums. Now Elena would have to make her own choice about what kind of life she wanted for herself and her child, and whether Marcus would be part of that life, or simply another obstacle to overcome on her journey toward financial independence and emotional security. Elena gave birth to her daughter Sarah on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 weeks after moving back into my house. Marcus arrived at the hospital 2 hours after I called him, smelling like alcohol and carrying flowers that looked like they'd been grabbed from a gas station convenience store. The past month had been transformative for Elena in ways that went far beyond preparing for motherhood. Living away from Marcus's constant pressure about investment opportunities and financial planning had given her mental clarity she hadn't experienced since the inheritance was revealed. She'd spent her days reading books about wealth management, attending online seminars about financial literacy, and having long conversations with Jonathan Morrison about her father's values and intentions. More importantly, Elena had begun to understand that inheriting $50 million wasn't just about money, it was about power, responsibility, and the freedom to make choices based on her own values, rather than other people's expectations or demands. Marcus's behavior during Elena's labor revealed everything about his priorities that needed to be revealed. While Elena was dealing with contractions and preparing to bring their daughter into the world, Marcus was on his phone researching cryptocurrency exchanges and texting with contacts from his networking events. When the nurse asked him to put the phone away, he complained that he was handling urgent financial matters that couldn't wait. "Congratulations, you're a father," the doctor announced as Sarah made her entrance into the world. Elena was crying with joy and exhaustion, reaching for her daughter with trembling hands. But Marcus's first question wasn't about the baby's health or Elena's condition. "When can we update the trust beneficiaries?" he asked, still holding his phone as if it might provide answers to questions about modifying legal documents. "Sarah should be included in the inheritance planning as soon as possible." The nurse and doctor exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the inappropriate nature of Marcus's priorities. Elena was still in active labor, holding their newborn daughter, and Marcus was already calculating how Sarah's existence would affect their access to trust funds. "Marcus," Elena said quietly, her voice hoarse from hours of labor, "can we please focus on our daughter right now? The financial planning can wait until we get home." But Marcus seemed incapable of setting aside his obsession with Elena's inheritance, even for the few hours required to celebrate his daughter's birth. He spent Elena's recovery time making phone calls about family financial planning and researching generation-skipping trust strategies on hospital Wi-Fi. "I stayed with Elena for most of her hospital stay, helping with feeding schedules and diaper changes while Marcus attended what he called essential business meetings that couldn't be postponed." His absence during those crucial first days spoke volumes about his understanding of fatherhood and family responsibility. "Mom," Elena said on our second night in the hospital, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms, "I've been thinking about what kind of life I want to build for her. What kind of example I want to set about how to handle responsibility and make good decisions." I could see Elena processing the magnitude of her situation, understanding that her choices would shape not just her own future but Sarah's understanding of wealth, relationships, and personal integrity. The inheritance was no longer just about Elena's security. It was about the kind of world she wanted to create for her daughter. "Marcus came by earlier while you were getting coffee," Elena continued. "He brought paperwork about setting up trust funds for Sarah, applications for private schools that cost more than most people make in a year, information about luxury real estate in gated communities. He's already planning Sarah's entire future based on access to money she didn't choose to inherit." The revelation didn't surprise me, but it confirmed my fears about how Marcus would approach fatherhood. Instead of focusing on Sarah's immediate needs for love, security, and attention, he was treating her like another component in his wealth optimization strategies. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I wanted to raise Sarah to understand the value of work and education before she learns about the family money," Elena replied. "I told him I wanted her to develop her own sense of worth and capability before she has to deal with the complexities of inherited wealth." It was exactly the approach I'd hoped Elena would choose, evidence that she'd learned the lessons I'd tried to teach through my own parenting decisions. Sarah deserved the same opportunity Elena had received. The chance to become her own person before money complicated her understanding of herself and her place in the world. Marcus's reaction to Elena's parenting philosophy had been predictably negative. He'd accused her of repeating her mother's mistakes, of denying Sarah opportunities that the inheritance could provide, of letting outdated ideas about character building interfere with practical wealth management. "He said you brainwashed me," Elena admitted with a sad smile. "He said I was choosing your values over his vision for our family's future." He couldn't understand why anyone would deliberately delay a child's access to financial advantages. The fundamental difference between Elena's and Marcus's approaches to parenting highlighted the deeper incompatibility that had developed in their marriage. Elena wanted to raise Sarah with the same values that had shaped her own character: hard work, independence, and appreciation for opportunities earned through personal effort. Marcus wanted to raise Sarah as a wealthy child from birth, surrounding her with luxury and privilege that would shape her identity from her earliest memories. "Elena," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something important. Can you imagine staying married to someone who fundamentally disagrees with your values about money, work, and child rearing? She was quiet for a long time, watching Sarah sleep while considering the implications of my question. The marriage she'd entered with such hope and excitement had become a battlefield where every decision about their daughter's future would require negotiating with someone whose priorities were incompatible with her own. I keep hoping he'll change back into the man I married, Elena said finally. I keep thinking that once the initial shock of the inheritance wears off, Marcus will remember who he was before money became his primary focus. I understood Elena's hope, but I'd observed enough of Marcus's behavior to know that his transformation wasn't temporary adjustment to new circumstances. It was a revelation of his true character, values that had always existed but had been hidden until wealth made them relevant to his daily life. Elena, the man you married is the man who called me a cheap gift giver at your baby shower, I said gently. The man who dismissed your family background and made jokes about your mother's financial limitations. The money didn't change Marcus's values, it just gave him permission to express values he'd always held. Elena winced at the reminder of Marcus's behavior before the inheritance was revealed, acknowledging the truth of what I was saying. The signs of his character had been visible long before money became a factor in their relationship, but Elena had made excuses for his attitudes because she'd loved the person he could be when he chose to be kind and supportive. Sarah stirred in Elena's arms, making the small sounds that newborns make when they're transitioning between sleep and wakefulness. Elena adjusted her position to make Sarah more comfortable, her movements natural and instinctive in ways that suggested she would be an excellent mother regardless of the financial resources at her disposal. I want to be the kind of mother who protects her child from harmful influences, Elena said quietly, watching Sarah's face with an expression of fierce protectiveness. Even if one of those harmful influences is the child's father. It was a painful admission, acknowledging that Marcus had become a threat to Sarah's emotional and psychological development rather than a supportive partner in raising their daughter. But it was also evidence of Elena's growing strength and clarity about her responsibilities as a mother. We brought Sarah home to my house the following Thursday, Elena having made the decision to extend her stay indefinitely while she figured out her next steps. Marcus had been furious about the arrangement, demanding that his wife and daughter return to their apartment where he could be involved in daily care decisions and continue his financial planning discussions. This is kidnapping, he'd accused during one particularly heated phone call. You're keeping my daughter away from me because you don't like my ideas about financial planning. But Elena had held firm, explaining that she needed space to focus on Sarah's immediate needs without the constant pressure of investment discussions and wealth management schemes. She'd invited Marcus to visit whenever he wanted to spend time with Sarah, but she'd made it clear that those visits couldn't include business discussions or attempts to pressure her about financial decisions. Marcus's visits revealed everything about his capacity for fatherhood that needed to be revealed. He would arrive with expensive baby clothes and high-end equipment that Sarah was too young to use, gifts that seemed designed more for social media photos than practical infant care. He would hold Sarah for brief periods while scrolling through his phone, checking cryptocurrency prices and responding to messages from his networking contacts. Most tellingly, Marcus showed no interest in the daily realities of caring for a newborn. He never offered to help with feedings or diaper changes, never stayed long enough to experience the exhaustion and commitment that parenting actually required. His visits felt more like photo opportunities than genuine attempts to bond with his daughter. He treats Sarah like an accessory, Elena observed after one particularly frustrating visit, where Marcus had spent more time photographing himself holding the baby than actually interacting with her. Like she's something he owns rather than someone he's responsible for protecting and nurturing. Elena's assessment was accurate and heartbreaking. Marcus's approach to fatherhood mirrored his approach to Elena's inheritance. He saw Sarah primarily as an asset that enhanced his social status and financial opportunities rather than as a person deserving love, attention, and careful guidance. The contrast between Marcus's parenting style and Ellen's natural maternal instincts became more apparent with each passing day. Elena was completely devoted to Sarah's well-being, attentive to every sound and movement, instinctively prioritizing her daughter's needs over her own comfort or convenience. She was becoming the kind of mother I'd always hoped she would be, someone who understood that love was expressed through daily care and sacrifice rather than expensive purchases and future planning. 3 months after Sarah's birth, Elena made the decision that had been building since the baby shower confrontation. She filed for divorce from Marcus, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking full custody of Sarah with supervised visitation rights for her father. Marcus's response was predictably focused on financial implications rather than emotional ones. He immediately hired an attorney specializing in high-net-worth divorce cases, someone who advertised expertise in protecting marital assets from prenuptial agreement loopholes. His social media posts during this period were full of cryptic references to fighting for what's rightfully mine and protecting my daughter's future. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of Marcus's financial recklessness during the months since learning about Elena's inheritance. He'd accumulated over $40,000 in credit card debt, defaulted on the lease for his luxury car, and borrowed money from family members to fund his investment research and networking activities. The man who'd criticized my modest gift-giving had been living completely beyond his means, while pressuring his pregnant wife to risk millions of dollars on speculative investments. The financial irresponsibility speaks to Mr. Hayes's fitness as a parent, Elena's attorney argued during custody hearings. A man who accumulates significant debt while pressuring his wife to make risky investments with inherited funds demonstrates poor judgment that could affect his decision-making regarding the child's welfare. Marcus's attorney tried to paint Elena's divorce filing as evidence of financial manipulation by her mother, claiming that I had alienated his client's wife from her marriage through fear-mongering about investment opportunities. But the evidence of Marcus's behavior spoke for itself: the debt accumulation, the pressure tactics, the threats of divorce when Elena sought professional financial advice, the obsession with wealth optimization during his daughter's birth. The custody arrangement that emerged from the legal proceedings reflected the reality of Marcus's approach to parenting. He was granted supervised visitation rights with Sarah every other weekend, with provisions that prohibited financial discussions during those visits. Elena retained full legal custody, with authority to make all major decisions about Sarah's upbringing, education, and welfare. More significantly for Elena's long-term security, the divorce settlement confirmed that Marcus had no claim to her inherited assets. The prenuptial agreement held up under legal scrutiny, and the trust modifications Elena had implemented provided additional protection against any attempts to access her inheritance through custody or support claims. Marcus's behavior during the divorce proceedings revealed his true priorities one final time. While Elena was focused on ensuring Sarah's stability and security during the transition, Marcus was primarily concerned with negotiating the highest possible alimony payments and exploring whether Sarah's status as an inheritance beneficiary might provide him with ongoing financial claims. He asked for spousal support equal to what he claimed was his expected standard of living based on Elena's inheritance. Jonathan Morrison explained after reviewing the final settlement documents. His attorney argued that Marcus had left his career to focus on wealth management and therefore deserved compensation for lost earning potential. The audacity of Marcus's financial demands was breathtaking but not surprising. He was essentially asking to be paid for the months he'd spent pressuring Elena to make risky investments, claiming that his unpaid financial advisory services entitled him to ongoing support from the inheritance he'd never been legally entitled to access. Elena's response to Marcus's demands was firm and decisive. She agreed to temporary spousal support that would help Marcus re-establish his career and financial independence, but she refused to provide the kind of permanent financial settlement that would allow him to continue living as if he had ongoing access to her inheritance.
I want Sarah to have a relationship with her father, Elena explained during our conversations about the settlement negotiations. But I also want her to understand that love and support are earned through care and commitment, not purchased through financial arrangements. Elena's approach to the divorce reflected the same values that had guided her decisions about the inheritance: careful consideration of long-term consequences, protection of resources that would benefit Sarah's future, and refusal to be manipulated by emotional pressure or financial demands. The final divorce decree was signed on a warm day in September, almost exactly 1 year after the baby shower that had started everything. Elena had spent that year learning about wealth management, developing financial literacy, and discovering her own strength as a mother and independent woman. Sarah was 6 months old by then, a happy baby who seemed to thrive in the stable environment Elena had created at my house. Elena had decided to stay with me permanently, converting the upstairs into a private apartment where she and Sarah could have their own space while benefiting from the support system of extended family. "I want Sarah to grow up knowing her grandmother," Elena explained when I protested that I didn't need them to stay for my benefit. "I want her to learn about family loyalty and interdependence, about how people take care of each other across generations." Elena's decision to remain in my house represented more than just practical convenience. It was a choice about the kind of family structure she wanted to create for Sarah, an acknowledgement that wealth couldn't replace the fundamental human needs for connection, support, and belonging. Marcus's visitation with Sarah continued according to the custody schedule, but his interest in fatherhood proved to be as shallow and temporary as his interest in Elena's inheritance had been intense. Within 6 months of the divorce, his visits became sporadic and brief, often cancelled due to business commitments or travel plans related to his renewed focus on his insurance career. "He sends expensive gifts for Sarah's birthday and Christmas," Elena reported during one of our evening conversations while Sarah played with simple wooden toys on the living room floor. "Designer clothes she'll outgrow in 3 months, educational gadgets that are too advanced for her age. But he doesn't call to ask about her development or request extra time to spend with her." Marcus's approach to fatherhood confirmed everything Elena had learned about his character during their marriage. He was interested in the appearance of being a devoted father, in the social media posts and holiday photographs that suggested he was actively involved in Sarah's life. But he had no patience for the daily realities of parenting, no interest in the small moments and gradual development that actually constitute a child's upbringing. Elena, by contrast, had embraced every aspect of motherhood with the same dedication she'd brought to her nursing career. She was attentive to Sarah's needs, creative about stimulating her development, and patient with the challenges that came with caring for a young child while managing significant financial responsibilities. More importantly, Elena had begun to understand her inheritance as a tool for creating positive change rather than just ensuring personal security. She'd established a scholarship fund for nursing students from low-income families, honoring both her father's values and her own professional experience. She'd also begun funding housing initiatives that continued Thomas's commitment to providing affordable homes for working families. "I want Sarah to understand that wealth comes with responsibilities," Elena said as we watched her daughter take her first tentative steps across the living room. "Not just the responsibility to preserve and grow money, but the responsibility to use resources in ways that benefit other people." Elena's approach to philanthropy reflected the lessons she'd learned about money and character over the past year. She wasn't interested in grand gestures or public recognition, but in quiet, consistent support for causes that aligned with her family's values and her own life experience. Sarah celebrated her first birthday in my backyard, surrounded by Elena's friends from the hospital, neighbors who'd become like family, and the small circle of relatives who'd supported us through the challenges of the past year. Marcus attended the party, bringing an elaborate gift that cost more than most families spend on birthday celebrations, but leaving early to attend what he described as an important business meeting. "Look at her," Elena said as Sarah tried to blow out her birthday candle, her chubby cheeks puffed with effort while cake frosting decorated her face. "She has no idea that she's inheriting millions of dollars someday. Right now, she's just a happy little girl who loves to play with cardboard boxes and listen to nursery rhymes." Elena's perspective on Sarah's inheritance had evolved significantly from the anxiety and overwhelm she'd felt when the trust fund was first revealed. She now understood that Sarah's wealth would be an advantage to be managed carefully, rather than a burden to be feared or a solution to be optimized immediately. "She'll learn about the money when she's old enough to understand responsibility," Elena continued, echoing the philosophy that had guided my own parenting decisions. "But first she'll learn about work and kindness, and taking care of people who need help. The money will make those lessons more powerful, but it won't replace them." As Sarah grew from a baby into a toddler, Elena's confidence as a mother and wealth manager continued to develop. She took courses in financial planning, attended conferences about philanthropy and social investing, and gradually took on more responsibility for managing her inheritance under Jonathan Morrison's guidance. Marcus's role in Sarah's life continued to diminish as his initial enthusiasm for fatherhood gave way to the reality that parenting required ongoing commitment rather than periodic grand gestures. His visits became less frequent, his gifts more generic, his interest in Sarah's development more superficial. Sarah asks about Daddy sometimes. Elena told me when Sarah was almost 2 years old and beginning to notice that other children had fathers who lived with them. I tell her that Daddy loves her but lives in a different house, that some families have different arrangements but the love is still real. Elena's approach to explaining Marcus's limited involvement was age-appropriate and honest without being bitter or accusatory. She wanted Sarah to have positive feelings about her father while also understanding that families came in different configurations and that love was measured by actions rather than promises. By Sarah's second birthday, the transformation in Elena's life was complete. She'd evolved from a young woman overwhelmed by sudden wealth into a confident mother and responsible wealth manager who understood both the opportunities and obligations that came with her inheritance. The baby shower confrontation that had started everything seemed like a distant memory, though its lessons continued to shape Elena's daily decisions. Marcus's casual dismissal of my gifts and his family's financial background had revealed character traits that ultimately made him unsuitable as a partner for someone carrying the responsibilities Elena had inherited. "You saved me from making a terrible mistake," Elena said as we sat on the porch one evening, watching Sarah play in the garden where I'd spent so many years planning for this moment. "If you hadn't revealed the trust fund when you did, I might have spent years trying to make my marriage work with someone who didn't really respect me or understand what it means to be part of a family." Elena's gratitude was touching, but I knew that she'd saved herself through her own strength and good judgment. The inheritance had provided her with options, but Elena had chosen wisely among those options based on her own values and her instincts about what kind of life she wanted to build for herself and her daughter. Sarah was 3 years old when Elena met David Chen, a pediatric nurse at the Children's Hospital, where Elena had begun volunteering with family support programs. David's response to learning about Elena's financial situation was everything Marcus's had not been: respectful, thoughtful, and focused on Elena's character rather than her bank account. He asked me about my philanthropic work before he asked me about my investment portfolio. Elena reported after their first few dates. He wanted to know about my values and my goals for Sarah's upbringing. The inheritance was just part of my background, not the most interesting thing about me. David's approach to wealth was shaped by his own experience growing up in a family that had immigrated with limited resources and built security through hard work and careful saving. He understood both the value of money and its limitations, appreciating Elena's inheritance as a tool for security and positive impact without being overwhelmed by its magnitude. More importantly, David's interaction with Sarah was natural and genuinely affectionate. He treated her as a person deserving attention and respect, rather than as an extension of Elena's financial assets. Sarah in turn responded to David's patience and playfulness with the kind of trust and affection she'd never shown with Marcus. "Sarah calls him Uncle David," Elena said with obvious happiness after they'd been dating for several months. "She runs to the door when he comes over, wants to show him her drawings and her new words. It's the kind of relationship I always hoped she'd have with her father." Elena and David married when Sarah was 4 years old in a small ceremony in my backyard, surrounded by family and friends who understood the importance of choosing partners based on character rather than financial considerations. Sarah served as flower girl, scattering rose petals from my garden while wearing a simple dress that she'd helped choose from a regular department store. Marcus attended Sarah's kindergarten graduation, but left immediately after the ceremony, missing the family celebration that followed. His detachment from Sarah's daily life had become so complete that she barely seemed to notice his absence, her attention focused on the people who were actually present for her important moments. "Sarah has a different kind of relationship with Marcus now," Elena explained when Sarah was 6 and beginning to understand family relationships more clearly. "She knows he's her biological father, but she also knows that David is the parent who helps with homework and remembers to pack her lunch and comes to her school plays. Elena's handling of Sarah's relationship with both her biological and stepfather reflected the wisdom she'd gained about the difference between biological connections and emotional bonds. Sarah was learning that family was defined by love and commitment rather than genetics or financial arrangements. The inheritance that had once seemed like such an overwhelming responsibility had become integrated into Elena's life as a tool for security, opportunity, and positive impact. Sarah was growing up with the same values Elena had learned as a child: the importance of work, education, kindness, and taking care of people who needed help. She doesn't know about the trust fund yet, Elena said when Sarah was 7, and beginning to ask questions about why their family had different rules about money than some of her classmates. She knows that Grandma Margaret makes good decisions about family finances and that we're fortunate to have security and opportunities. But she thinks our lifestyle comes from David's and my work, which in many ways it does. Elena's approach to Sarah's financial education mirrored the gradual revelation strategy I'd used with Elena herself. Sarah was learning about budgeting and saving through age-appropriate experiences, developing an understanding of money as something earned through effort and used responsibly to meet needs and help others. The transformation in Elena's life, from the woman who'd been overwhelmed by her baby shower revelation to the confident mother and wealth manager she'd become, was a testament to the values Thomas had wanted to pass to his daughter. Elena had learned to balance the opportunities her inheritance provided with the responsibilities it entailed, using her resources to create security for her family while contributing to causes that reflected her father's commitment to helping others. Sarah's childhood was unfolding exactly as Elena had planned, filled with love, learning, and gradual understanding of the privileges and responsibilities that would someday be hers to manage. The inheritance was part of her family's story, but it wasn't the defining element of her identity or her daily experience. Marcus remained in Sarah's life peripherally, a man who sent birthday cards and Christmas presents but had never developed the emotional connection that comes from consistent involvement in a child's daily routine. His transformation during Elena's inheritance revelation had revealed character traits that made him unsuitable as a full-time parent, and Sarah was thriving under the care of adults who prioritized her emotional needs over financial opportunities. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never revealed the trust fund," I said to Elena one evening as we watched Sarah and David work together on a science project at the kitchen table. "Whether you and Marcus might have worked out your problems if money hadn't complicated everything." Elena considered the question seriously before responding. "The money didn't create Marcus's character flaws, Mom. It just revealed them. If we'd stayed together without the inheritance being disclosed, I would have spent years married to someone who fundamentally didn't respect me or my family." Sarah would have grown up with a father who taught her that appearances were more important than authenticity. Elena's analysis was perceptive and probably accurate. The inheritance revelation had accelerated the timeline of Marcus's character exposure, but his attitudes about class, family, and financial responsibility had been evident long before the baby shower confrontation. Money had simply provided the context in which those attitudes became impossible to ignore or excuse. "I'm grateful for the inheritance," Elena continued, "but I'm more grateful for the clarity it provided about the people in my life. I learned who really loved me and who saw me as an opportunity. I learned who would support my values and who would pressure me to abandon them. Those lessons were worth more than the money itself." Elena's perspective on her inheritance had evolved into something mature and balanced, understanding both its benefits and its limitations. She'd learned to use wealth as a tool for creating the kind of life she wanted rather than allowing it to dictate her choices or relationships. Sarah, now 8 years old, was developing her own understanding of family, responsibility, and the difference between privilege and entitlement. Her relationship with David had given her a model of what supportive partnership looked like, while her limited contact with Marcus had taught her that biological connections didn't automatically create emotional bonds. The scholarship fund Elena had established in her father's memory had grown into a significant program that had helped dozens of nursing students complete their education and begin careers serving others. The housing initiatives she supported continued Thomas's commitment to providing affordable homes for working families, creating lasting positive impact in communities across the region. "This is what Dad wanted," Elena said, as we reviewed the annual reports from her philanthropic investments. Not just for me to have financial security, but for me to use that security to help other people build better lives for their families. Elena's understanding of her father's intentions had deepened over the years as she'd learned more about his business practices and personal values. Thomas hadn't just built wealth, he'd built wealth through work that benefited others, and he'd structured Elena's inheritance to encourage the same kind of values-driven decision-making. The baby shower confrontation that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately become the catalyst for positive changes that might never have occurred without that moment of revelation. Marcus's cruel comments about cheap gifts had exposed attitudes that needed to be addressed before they could cause deeper damage to Elena's sense of self-worth and family loyalty. I still have that blanket you knitted for Sarah, Elena said, thinking back to the gifts that had triggered Marcus's dismissive comments. It's in her memory box along with other things from when she was a baby. Someday I'll tell her about the love and time you put into making it, about how it represented everything Marcus couldn't understand about real value. The blanket had become a symbol of the difference between genuine care and expensive gestures, between love expressed through time and attention versus love demonstrated through financial expenditure. Sarah would grow up understanding those distinctions through the examples set by the adults who actually participated in raising her. Marcus's sporadic presence in Sarah's life continued according to the custody arrangement, but his impact on her development had become minimal compared to the consistent influence of Elena, David, and me. Sarah's understanding of family was being shaped by people who prioritized emotional connection over financial opportunity, who measured success by the quality of relationships rather than the accumulation of assets. The inheritance that had once seemed like such an overwhelming burden had become fully integrated into Elena's identity as a mother, wife, and community member. She'd learned to balance the privileges wealth provided with the responsibilities it entailed, using her resources to create security for her immediate family, while contributing to causes that reflected her values and honored her father's memory. Sarah's future was being shaped by the same principles that had guided Elena's upbringing: hard work, education, kindness to others, and understanding that privilege came with obligations to help those who had fewer opportunities. The inheritance would provide Sarah with advantages and choices, but those advantages would be built on a foundation of character and values that money couldn't buy. Sarah will handle the inheritance better than I did, Elena predicted as we watched her daughter help David with grocery shopping, carefully comparing prices and checking items off their list. She's growing up with financial literacy and emotional security from the beginning. When she learns about the trust fund someday, it will be one more tool in a toolkit she's already learned to use responsibly. Elena's confidence in Sarah's future reflected the successful integration of wealth and values that had been Thomas's original intention when he'd structured the inheritance. Sarah was developing into exactly the kind of person who could handle significant financial resources responsibly. Someone who understood both the opportunities and obligations that came with privilege. The transformation that had begun with Marcus's cruel comments at a baby shower had ultimately led to Elena's empowerment as a mother, wealth manager, and community member. She'd learned to protect herself and her daughter from harmful influences, while using her resources to create positive change in the lives of others. "Thank you," Elena said simply, as we sat on the porch one evening, watching Sarah play in the garden, where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. "For protecting the inheritance, for teaching me about values and responsibility, for showing me that real wealth comes from the relationships we build and the people we help." Elena's gratitude was touching, but I knew that she'd earned her success through her own choices and character. The inheritance had provided opportunities, but Elena had chosen wisely among those opportunities based on values that couldn't be purchased or inherited. Sarah's laughter echoed through the garden as she chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, a happy child who was learning about love, security, and responsibility through the examples of adults who'd chosen to prioritize her well-being over financial gain. The inheritance would someday provide her with choices and opportunities, but her character was being shaped by experiences that money couldn't buy. The baby shower had ended with Marcus's humiliation and the revelation of Elena's inheritance. But the real story had been the transformation of a young woman who'd learned to balance will with values, creating a life that honored both her father's intentions and her own principles about family, responsibility, and service to others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.